So I think that I came across a good way to represent that whole idea that I was trying to express the other day in this macrocosmic and microcosmic way, where we recognize the self but recognize everything at the same time. It comes from the idea that one single word can be like a ball, something that moves, and it's this image of this thing that can be looked upon from every angle, and it's smooth no matter which direction you're coming at it from, but it means multiple things any which way it can move, it can be. And I thought that the best way to represent that idea of fate and free will is perhaps with the first idea of matter being something that splits into everything else. And it's this whole idea of, is this a moment that we can understand and express, or is this idea something that words themselves cannot seem to capture? But I think that it's in this use of words where we can gravitate towards what we're saying meaning nothing. So when I say this whole idea that everything is one, and in this state of matter, everything is a superposition. Now, how do we understand the moment that everything actually moves or becomes something? At what point in time is that? Is there any action at all to this expression? And I think that the way that I expressed it the best was everything matters. So at that moment that everything itself has no expression, no difference, it's all the same thing. At that moment, everything matters. And in that moment, it's the expression that everything is itself while being nothing. So as soon as everything matters, it's almost like nothing matters. And the more nothing matters, the more that we can come to a state of realization and identification and recognize the difference of things. And then I went on to say that sex itself is merely wanting. So if that's the case, then maybe the spirit of my race is this whole idea of difference. This idea that what's come, what's went, is this idea that there's always more. There's always more to it. And the more that you look at it, the more that you actually go right through it. So everything's nothing. And nothing matters. But at the same point in time, when that's your attitude, everything then fits. And so we can silence our minds and witness it. Everything is the same. Everything is the same thing. All of it matters. And so at that moment where we lose ourselves, like I was speaking about before, we recognize that we are nothing. And then we're everything once more. I believe that's how free will and fate actually work hand in hand. At that moment, then maybe we're like the word. And by our ability to handle a ball, eventually we can come to a place where we can express it all. So maybe fate leads to freedom, and all freedom leads to fate. That point in time where we recognize we're something simple, we're something great. All things exist in irony, dichotomy, contradictions. That's like the middle ground. But it's in extreme confliction. And I hope you guys like my pink lemonade outfit that I got going on today. And if you're all wondering what I had to say while I look this way, that's it. That's what I'm saying. And now I can listen to what kind of ball you're playing. Hello, everybody. Well, my piercing ear is still here. Thought I'd play with it in that way, see how long this single thing can last. Like, that's how it splits, you know? Anyways, I'm just gonna read my book here for a little bit. Probably do a time lapse. What's up, guys? What's up, guys? I just finished this book, and in all honesty, this might be one of my favorite books of all time, actually. I got to the end where there's a translator's note, and after the chapter of multiplicity, there was a chapter that was going to be written, the sixth memo that we're missing, called consistency. It almost fits kind of perfectly in with this theme. I mean, how many times can we actually allow there to be this thing that is out of our reach, which motivates us to move us, and it is this negative which produces all the positive that we can then see and witness. And maybe life is merely the motion of this negative and the reflection of this positive that creates everything. And I wanted to go over briefly some things that I kind of highlighted again in the chapter Visibility, where he talks about the birth of modern art. He talks about le chef d'oeuvre inconnu has often been treated as a parable on the development of modern art. So I thought that was kind of important to put in there. And then also I made note of this, where he tries to come to some concise thought about everything that goes into something. Let's say that various elements come together to form the visual part of the literary imagination, direct observation of the real world, phantasmal, and oniric transfiguration, the figurative world as transmitted by the culture as its various levels, and a process of abstraction, condensation, and interiorization of sensory experience, which is crucial for visualizing as it is for verbalizing thought. So there is kind of like his concise attempt to try to summarize everything that goes into an experience, basically, at that point, is what you're describing. So moving on from that chapter, though, we get to the chapter of multiplicity. And this chapter begins with an excerpt by somebody who he describes as, Italo describes as, in that he sees the world as a system of systems in which each individual system conditions the others and is conditioned by them. And the way that I think about this is, if you expand upon one thing enough, eventually it becomes everything. And then maybe at that point that it becomes everything, it becomes nothing, and then it can realize its self. And what the self really is the allowance of expression. And then when something can express itself, it realizes these things about what it is. And then we have things for what they are in this world. And in that way, something emotional is just as factual as something which is particulated or systematic or methodical, calculative, or combinatorically. All of these things ultimately result from something that I can express poetically. And, you know, he goes on to describe sort of some more styles, and he talks about a man named Gada. He says, in Gada's shorter pieces, as in every episode of his novels, even the most minor of objects is seen as the center of a network of relations that the writer can't help but trace, causing details to multiply until his descriptions and digressions become endless. So he then goes on to kind of summarize this again. A knowledge of things as the convergence of infinite relations, past and future, real or possible, demands that everything be accurately named, described, and located in space and time. This is achieved by exploiting the semantic potential of words and the full range of verbal and syntactical forms with their connotations and colorations and the often comedic effects produced by their juxtaposition. And we've kind of been on this journey where he talks about, you know, what is this sense of expression and where does expression come from? Is it this idea of want? Is it the same thing for everything? This idea that maybe there's something and all we can do is sort of search. But really, if we come to the place where we can recognize that maybe that's what it is, then maybe we can recognize a further truth within that idea. And I think that that idea is that maybe everything is real and everything should be taken for what it is. And that's where we got into the idea of, you know, sort of modern art, which he was expressing before. And actually I might go back now where he describes this. It's going to be really cool how it sort of connects right here. In the years to come, Balzac rejects the literature of the fantastic, which for him has meant art as mystical knowledge of everything, and he undertakes the minute description of the world as it is, still convinced that he is expressing the secret of life. And maybe the secret of life is just embarrassment. Maybe everything is known, but the only reason we don't know everything is because we're embarrassed, which should reveal to an extent that everything is about the approach, but also that everything is about a feeling as well. And this is kind of where this writing sort of, you know, goes into in the very end over here is something similar to that. And this chapter actually really captures kind of what I spoke about over there. Oddly enough, you know, I'm on this same track, I'm on this same train of thought. And in all honesty, this book probably represents the way that I think personally more than any book that I've ever read in my entire life. You know, just literally to an exactitude that almost seems like some sort of whimsical fate that I came across it in the first place. But, you know, just sort of kind of going along with that, he and see, I'm just almost like just saying things in the exact same way, but worded differently. Passion for knowledge thus leads Gada from the objectivity of the world to his own exasperated subjectivity. To know is to insert something into the real, and therefore to deform the real. So in this book, Gada, the La Cognition del Douleur, knowledge of grief, in this book, Gada breaks into a wild invective against the pronoun I. Indeed, against all pronouns, those parasites of thought, the I, vilest of all pronouns. They're the lice of thought. When thought has lice, it scratches like anyone else who has lice, and under its nails, then you find pronouns, personal pronouns. And it's through this that we gain sort of this understanding, this expression, which seems so out of control. And that's where we're going to go to next with this idea of multiplicity, is this idea, that through this sort of feeling, there is knowledge. Actually, I might jump ahead and talk about what he says at the very end here before I move on. Because what he says is that, and I have another reply, one that may be closer to my heart. What if it were possible for a work to be conceived beyond the self? A work that allowed us to escape the limited perspective of the individual ego, not only in order to enter other similar selves, but to give voice to that which cannot speak. The bird perched on the gutter, the tree in spring and the tree in autumn, stone, cement, plastic. Wasn't this perhaps where Ovid was going when he described the continuity of forms, where Lucretius was going when he identified himself with the nature that all things have in common? So he's going to try and rein this in now, though, because it's like this expression is ultimately as close as we can get to nothing. It's like that idea of fading, and it's exhaustible. And maybe it's sort of a resource as well, this idea that we can emotionally connect ourselves with nothing almost, to sort of realize maybe this place where we have choice and decision. We have choice and decision to make. And I just highlighted this portion because to me it sounded like a really good, trying to see who it comes from here. Okay, yeah. I'm gonna highlight this right now because this is just what I was saying. The world expands until it becomes ungraspable, and for Proust, it is through the suffering of this ungraspability that we come to knowledge. And maybe knowledge is choice. Again, like I said, maybe before it's embarrassment, but maybe all things have feelings. And it's in our ability to connect with things in a way which allows us to approach them, given all these tools, that allows us to actually figure out divine what something itself might say. And I understood the impossibility love comes up against. We imagine it has as its object a being that can be laid down before us, enclosed within a body. Alas, it is the extension of that being to every point in space and time that it has occupied or will occupy. If we do not possess its contact with a given place, a given hour, then we do not possess it, but we cannot touch all those points. If only they were marked for us, perhaps we could stretch out and reach them, but we grope without finding them. Hence, mistrust, jealousy, paranoia. We waste precious time following an absurd trail and pass unsuspectingly by the truth. And it's in this idea that everything is present, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit too. So he then goes on to say, overly ambitious projects may be objectionable in many fields of endeavor, but not in literature. Literature can survive. He's again saying, we should be searching for these things, which was what I was kind of saying as well. Survive only by pursuing outsized goals, even those beyond all hope of achievement. Only if poets and writers set themselves tasks that no one else dares to imagine will literature continue to serve a purpose. And I'm having some trust here because I was going on a train of thought, and I know that I connect with it up here coming up in a little bit. So I believe that then we're going to go on these writers trying to express this idea of everything. And this is what the most contemporary writers, this is 1780 Goethe, he's talking about, confided to Charlotte von Stein, and a novel about the universe, Roman über das Weltall. I believe that a poem about empty space could achieve great sublimity. Ich glaub, dass ein Gedicht auf den leeren Raum einer grüben Erhabenheit fähig wäre. The universe and the void all return to these two terms between which swings the aim of literature and which often seem to mean the same thing.
So it's in that moment that we have a choice, that we can define ourselves. And we realize that that's the fate of all things. The fate of all things might be choice. And that actually works out pretty well and uses this juxtaposition and this wordplay that we're talking about to a perfection almost. Must we conclude that in their experience, encyclopedia and nothingness fused together, but behind the two characters stands Flaubert, who in order to feed their adventures chapter by chapter must build up his own expertise in every branch of learning, erecting an edifice of science for his two heroes to knock down? Do you know how many volumes I've had to soak up for my two fine fellows? More than 1,500. So this man that he's talking about was reading all aspects of life to try and come up with this novel, this idea again, to create this encyclopedia of nothing. So then he goes on to describe what actually develops of this practice from these writers. What develops in the great novels of the 20th century is the idea of an open encyclopedia. And here the adjective, of course, contradicts the noun, which derives etymologically from the presumption that all the world's knowledge could be gathered and enclosed in a circle. Now, any totality that's not potential, speculative, or plural is no longer thinkable. If medieval literature tended toward works that assimilated human knowledge into stable, compact, ordered forms, works such as the Divine Comedy, where multifarious linguistic riches meet the application of systematic and unified thinking, the best-loved modern books, by contrast, arise from the confluence and collision of the multiplicity of interpretive methods, modes of thought, and styles of expression. And I'm just going to read along here, kind of what I've highlighted. I have sought, am seeking, and will seek what I call total phenomenon. That is to say, the all of consciousness, relations, conditions, possibilities, impossibilities. Among the qualities I would like to see passed down to and embraced by the literature of the next millennium, this one is foremost: a taste for exactitude and intellectual order, in which the intelligence of poetry joins that of science and philosophy, as it does in Valerie's prose. He's talking about an individual. And then we're again talking about, this idea that something relates to everything at the same time and has this multiplicity while being singular again. The Garden of Forking Paths is presented as a spy story, which contains a story of logic and metaphysics, which in turn contains the description of an endless Chinese novel, all of this condensed into a dozen pages. I reflected that everything happens to everyone, precisely now, centuries upon centuries, and only in the present do things occur. Innumerable men in the air, on land, and at sea, and everything that appears happens to me. Then the idea of time determined by will, in which the future appears as irrevocable as the past. And finally, the story's central idea, a multiple ramified time in which every present forks into two futures so as to form a growing, dizzying network of diverging, converging, and parallel times. This is exactly how I've been talking, which I was sort of condemned for in the past little bit. It's such a relief to come across basically almost a summary of what I've been expressing, in which so many people around me have held in such contempt as I've tried to relate these things so that I could actually not only figure out what life is, but make that decision, make that choice. Maybe allow myself to make a mistake. Ultimately, be brief. But I would say that today the rule, be brief, is confirmed even by long novels whose structures often seem cumulative, modular, and combinatory. My temperament leads me to be brief, and these structures allow me to join density of invention and expression with a sense of infinite possibilities. So, we have this last quote here, and then we're going to be done with this book. Another quite false idea that is also widespread at the moment is the tendency to equate inspiration, exploration of the subconscious, and liberation, chance, automatism, and freedom. Now, this inspiration, which consists in blindly obeying every impulse, is in reality a kind of slavery. The classical author who, in writing his tragedy, follows a certain number of familiar rules is freer than the poet who writes down whatever comes into his head and who is a slave to other rules of which he is unaware. And I think that ultimately we come to the realization again that this is kind of leaning towards choice here at the end, I think. that if I had to interpret this and say where it could go next, possibly, in terms of philosophy, is that we're talking about choice. And choice itself is an irony, because as soon as you make a decision, choice is something that relates time into this equation. It then becomes a memory. And a memory is something which actually forms solidity within our reality, depending on how strong that memory is and how big the choice was that we made. I have come now to the end of my defense of the novel as a great art network. Some may contend that the more a work tends towards the multiplication of possibilities, the further it drifts from that unicum, that is the writer's self, from sincerity, from the discovery of personal truth. I would reply on the contrary. For who are we? Who is each of us, if not a combinatorics of experiences, of information, of things we have read and imagined? Every life is an encyclopedia, a library, an inventory of objects, a pattern, book of styles, in which everything can be constantly remixed and rearranged in every possible fashion. And I have another reply, one that may be closer to my heart. What if it were possible for a work to be conceived beyond the self? A work that allowed us to escape the limited perspective of the individual ego, not only in order to enter other similar selves, but to give voice to that which cannot speak. The bird perched on the gutter, the tree in spring and the tree in autumn, stone, cement, plastic. Wasn't this perhaps where Ovid was going when he described the continuity of forms? Where Lucretius was going when he identified himself with the nature that all things have in common? The end.